for joining us for this live broadcast this evening. I'm Gloria Quidu, Director of Caritas Consciousness Project. As our new name implies, our purpose is to promote the evolution of consciousness individually and collectively. The programs we select, whether addressing healing, paranormal faculties, spiritual exploration, or science, are all in the service of increasing our understanding of our true nature and our role in the unfoldment of our collective destiny. This evening, we're delighted again to have Claude Swanson here with us. This is the second in a 14-part lecture series on Dr. Swanson's new book, Science of the Soul, the Afterlife and The Shift. Dr. Swanson was educated as a physicist at MIT and Princeton University for more than 25 years, interspersed with his conventional professional career in applied physics. Dr. Swanson has pursued investigations into unconventional physics. His principal interest has been unified field theory, the so-called theory of everything, which could explain the universe at the deepest possible level. And this has led him to investigate many aspects of the paranormal, which appear to be completely real phenomena that violate our present science. So paranormal phenomena, which have now been proven in the laboratory in many cases, offer a window into the deeper universe, the mysteries of consciousness, and unlock new forces and principles which conventional science has only begun to glimpse. Dr. Swanson likes to address questions at the end of his talk. However, you can type in your question at any time by clicking the little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now let me present to you Dr. Claude Swanson.
Okay, very good. Well, wonderful to see everybody, although I can't say I actually see you, but I assume you're there. I can feel you're there, and it's delightful to be here. This will be the second chapter, the second lecture in the series. The first one was on the introduction of the book, Science of the Soul, the Afterlife and The Shift. The second lecture is based on the first chapter of the book, which is sort of a quick overview of some of the main pieces of evidence for the existence of the afterlife and its nature. And basically, as you know, I've spent the last 10 years or so writing this book, really trying to understand, first of all, what the evidence really is for the afterlife. How do we know that we have an afterlife? Why should we believe that? And the second question is, well, if it's real, then how can science explain it? Our Western science is sort of based on materialism, things you can feel and see, and the afterlife, almost by definition, spirits are elusive. We don't see them. If some gifted people can communicate, can see, and can hear them at various times, but in general, scientists have trouble believing or understanding that because we don't really know how to see the spirit world in a very reliable way yet. However, some ways are showing up. We're learning how to see more and more of the spirit world as our knowledge advances. There's a button on the screen that actually does respond, so we'll take that one. So my background, as you probably know by now, at MIT and Princeton, and I've done a lot of government and private industry consulting, and it was really my encounter with remote viewing in the 1980s when I learned that the government was doing serious work on it and that there are people that are able to do it very well, very accurately. That's what blew my mind and woke me up to the fact that these hidden worlds exist, these hidden aspects of consciousness that our science in its present form can't really understand. And the three books, as you know, kind of try to go through these various phenomena that we now know about The Synchronized Universe gave a brief overview of 12 different areas where we have examples of phenomena that don't fit to our present science. And some of those really are important in the afterlife. They give us clues that there is this other dimension that is not part of the physical world, that you could say is part of consciousness, is part of the spirit world. Our science has yet to really understand how to measure it, but it is quite real and it has consequences in our day-to-day life. And of course, that got some very good reviews, as I've presented before. Second book, Life Force, took the next step and went beyond that and tried to look at, well, what are these forces that are left out of present science? And Life Force talked about the energy of torsion, which the Russians have developed to a high degree now, and it does seem to be part of the missing energy that makes up the soul and makes the afterlife possible. It also makes psychokinesis possible. It makes the power of the mind possible. It makes energy healing at a distance possible, ESP, etc. So in many ways, the life force is the key to the paranormal phenomena that Western science is still learning about. And that also was very highly well received by many people and has been used in a couple of college classes. And then the third book, Science of the Soul, The Afterlife and The Shift, I've gone further and about 10 years of research, reading virtually everything I could find about the afterlife, lots of old experiments 100 years ago, as well as the new technology. And we find, again, there's more and more evidence than you would ever think there is, the deeper you look. And that's in the books. We'll talk about some of that today as a quick overview. Basically, this will be a sort of a survey of some of the highlights of the book, and then in later lectures, we'll go chapter by chapter in the book into more detail. So Daniel Brinkley, who's been dead 3 times and is still quite alive today, and one of the most colorful guides into the afterlife, has said, he looked out into the audience and says, "You're as dead right now as you're ever going to be." And that pretty much sums up the situation with the afterlife and the soul. The soul lives forever. The soul is the essence of who we are. And therefore, even after we die, we know our lifetimes are finite, but we have other lives. We go other places in between lives, and that's where the afterlife is. And then we come back and we have another life, and we keep on learning as we go through these cycles. And that's kind of what emerges from this whole process. One of the great mysterious frontiers for science is this whole area of consciousness that the quantum pioneers discovered 100 years ago, that consciousness affects our physics. It affects all quantum phenomena, and therefore it needs to be included in Western science. But right now it's not understood, and consciousness appears to be an integral part of the afterlife. It makes up an energy which plays an important role in the afterlife. And in my book, what I start off with is sort of emphasizing the point that I think we are kind of relearning right now in present day America, which is the power of intention, the power of the mind to guide us and to enable us to achieve our goals. Our society doesn't teach us much about this power. The common everyday belief is sort of that we're powerless, that it's a cause and effect world, that science will govern the end results of all events. And we're kind of discouraged from believing in how powerful our minds are. And that that energy really comes from the soul. It comes from the core of our existence. When we want something, we want to achieve something, we form an image in our mind. We have a vision. And if we put energy into the vision and hold it with intensity, it has a way of coming true. And this is remarkable. It's become the centerpiece for many personal development programs like Tony Robbins and Jonathan Parker and others who help us to practice. Many top athletes do this too. They visualize what they're going to do, jump that pole vault or that high jump or whatever it happens to be. And the more clearly you image it and the more firmly you focus on it and hold it in your mind, the more likely you are to succeed. And this works for golfers and all kinds of professional athletes. They pay people to teach them how to do this, but it's a useful skill for everyone. This is Andrew Carnegie on the left, who became one of the wealthiest people in the world, created the American steel industry and had a big part in the American railroad industry back in the 1900s, 1800s really. And on his right is Napoleon Hill, who he arranged to write a book about how Carnegie managed to be so successful. And the key was this power of visualization, the power of picking your goals, choosing your goals, and then making a picture, holding it vividly in your mind, putting energy into it. Napoleon Hill interviewed 25 or 30 or maybe even more of the top successes in science, business, and art in his time, introduced by Andrew Carnegie to them, and they all told him how they created. They explained to him their process, and in every case, they tended to confirm this basic idea that consciousness is powerful, consciousness can affect reality. And this is the great key that I think our civilization needs to remember at the present time. When we are faced with challenges or want to make the world better, want to make it more peaceful, make it healthier, the best way is is to meditate, to pray, to hold these images of how we want things to be and put power into them. I'm going to revamp on my website the synchronized prayer meditation, that global peace prayer, to help people to do that. But in general, the science that we have now seems to be saying this is real. It's not somebody's wishful thinking. It's a very real power that we all have. And so one of the keys that he stressed in the teachings was definiteness of purpose, that events and conditions in the outer world are the results of thoughts and intentions created and held by the mind. And then the second part is to apply to this thought the energy of the will, the power of the will, intensity of focus. It's your level of commitment that kind of energizes your vision to bring it into reality. William Buhlman, who's an expert on out-of-body experiences, teaches courses at Monroe Institute and is very adept at going out of body and having experiences and teaching people how to do it, explains every soul possesses the unlimited power of creation, but most remain unaware of their natural abilities. It is a sad irony that humans create their own reality, but fail to comprehend that they are the source of their creations. Instead of looking within for answers, they hope and pray for some external force to save them from their own thoughts. So this is really an important lesson that I think our civilization is up to facing and learning at the present time. And according to some writers, there are powerful groups in the world who attempt to manipulate events by controlling how we think and what we believe and what we expect. those in the control of the mass media, for example. But then they are, in turn, are controlled by others. And if you want to manage the world and shape events in a certain way, if you can make the media think that a certain thing is going to happen, that's a good way to get everybody's power of intention under your control. But we all have the individual power to hold our own thoughts, shape our own thoughts, choose our own goals. So if we just remember how much power we have and use it for the world that we want, then we'll have a much better outcome. So science does not understand this force. And I mentioned that the quantum pioneers discovered 100 years ago that it's very real and you can measure the effects of it, but they haven't figured out how to integrate it into present day science, and it's pretty much left out. I believe that torsion is part of the answer, and that's described in the second book, and I'm working on how to formalize that a little bit better, but I think we're going to find that torsion is the mediator of how our intentions do create our reality. But the afterlife and the nature of the soul are consequences of the power of consciousness. They're all connected to it. And that's really what I'll be talking about here in this lecture today. It's all about trying to understand that there can be realms that we don't see. We're kind of used to, believing what you can see, what you can feel, and that's the average way people say seeing is believing. But the great discoveries have been made when visionaries went beyond that and looked over the horizon. They sailed across the ocean to unknown continents, and they just discovered civilizations that no one knew were there before, and that's how we discover them. So there can be whole worlds that we don't know about, but if we explore and keep our minds open, we can discover that they exist. Likewise, the discoverer of radio and electronic communication, like Edison and Marconi, discovered that there are signals in the air that you can't see. But with the right equipment, you can pick them up, and then you can discover intelligences, other beings communicating on those signals. So again, there's an invisible world that they didn't know about. It operated at a different frequency, a different form, but by looking and keeping an open mind, we've discovered these things. So in the present time, we're discovering the power of consciousness, which is one more of these new worlds. This is a quick example of what a Chinese Qigong master can do with his mind. He's focusing on a radioactive decay of an element, americium, which is giving off alpha particles, and they're being measured by two kinds of detectors. And this is just like a Geiger counter. It gives a click, click, click when each particle gets detected, and it's measuring how fast the source is decaying radioactively. Now, it's supposed to be a constant. It's supposed to give off things at a more or less constant rate, and our physics doesn't really explain how you could change that. But in fact, the Chinese physicists who did the experiment asked this Qigong master to change the rate of the decay. They asked him to speed it up. And it went from being a flat curve to suddenly peaking up. And they said, okay, now cut it down again. And the decay rate went back down. And they said, okay, now let it go up and stay up. And it responded in the way that they asked. And he was, hundreds of miles away from the experiment when he was doing this. And they have two different kinds of detectors to show that it's not a fluke of the detector, it's the radioactivity that's being changed. So this is an example of how powerful the mind is to affect physical events, physical phenomena at a distance, even things that science would say you can't change. But the mind, the consciousness knows how to do it. According to Dolores Cannon, it was regressed many people into their afterlife and their uh, pre-incarnation and different parts of their soul's existence. She's concluded that one of the primary purposes of incarnation on Earth is to learn how to control our minds, how to use that focus to manifest. That's one of the reasons we go through this process. And one of the reasons is that in the afterlife, our ability to manifest is much stronger than it is here in the physical. Uh, the physical world is kind of a slowed down version where when you try to manifest something, you have to kind of work hard. You have to think about it, hold the image, and work at it pretty hard. It takes practice. So William Buhlman compares it to training wheels. He says that we can practice and develop our powers here because the earth is a much slower dimension for the power of thought. But in the afterlife, typically things manifest virtually instantly when you think of them. And that's another reason why in the afterlife there are many layers, many dimensions and vibrational levels. And typically you'll be in a level with people who are of a similar vibration to you, similar level of conscious development to you. And the reason is because if your other neighbors in the afterlife had a very violent or very aggressive personality, every time they manifested something, they thought of something, they would create things, and it could cause a lot of havoc for you and everyone else. So it's better to be with people of a similar vibration. So let's go over some of the other things that we're learning about the afterlife that are evidence of its reality. One of them is called ectoplasm. It's a very strange substance that is created by mediums, by gifted people called physical mediums, who are able to generate this substance. They go into a light trance. It oozes out of their orifices. It is considered to be half in the spiritual dimension and half in the physical dimension. So you can see it. It takes cells and fluids from the body of the medium and the people at the sitting, but it mixes it with something else that appears to be spiritual, and that enables the spirits to also manipulate the substance. And this is an example of a photograph of a person during a seance who is dead. Her name is On Ag. She's right here, the lady on the right. And she's been dead about 4 years at this point. She's a sister of the medium, Minnie Harrison. And during a seance, as you'll find out in a later chapter in the book, during a seance, these spirits in the afterlife have bodies. They have bodies which are in the spirit dimension. They're probably made of torsion energy and things like that. But they have the framework, the holographic pattern of a body, which then they can use to be covered with ectoplasm to form a physical looking body. They'll take some ectoplasm and pat it on their faces to make their faces visible. Ectoplasm is a fibrous material, and therefore it's often woven into fabric that they use to cover their bodies with to make it, to minimize the amount of ectoplasm that's needed in a seance. But this is just an example of how this lady on Ag frequently materialized at Minnie Harrison's seances. And next I'm going to show you a little quote from somebody who's in the audience when they came out. This is the testimony from a woman who was at the seance for the first time. She was kind of scared because she understood that she'd be meeting dead people and didn't know what it was going to be like. And so she says, before the sitting started, I was terrified. But after it started, to my astonishment, into the room in a full red light, because they just stop and say ectoplasm is very sensitive to light. Bright light will destroy it very quickly. So you have to use a red light, um, which in the old days was hard to make photographs with, but now we have very good cameras that can do it. Another alternative is infrared light. So into this full red light came this little old lady. She was absolutely fantastic. And this is on ag. She was jolly and friendly and full of fun. She came to each of us in turn and shook our hands and welcomed us. At that moment, all my fears left me. I saw her face clearly, very clearly. She was in like a little white shroud, the ectoplasm. Her face was a human face, lovely smile, laughing eyes. It was an old lady's hand I took hold of, warm, like meeting a living person. I just wish everyone knew this. After the old lady had gone, my mother's sister, Aunt Jane, came. In other words, she materialized next. She covered herself with ectoplasm and came out. So Aunt Jane was amazing. She'd been dead a couple of years, and this was her first time to materialize. I'll never forget it as long as I live. So this is just a glimpse of how dramatic and convincing a good seance by a physical medium can be when you get situations, events like this. Ectoplasm is also important in another phenomenon called direct voice. Uh, in that phenomenon, spirits use ectoplasm to make audible sounds that enable them to speak and to actually have a conversation with anyone in the room or to be recorded. And we have some mediums who've been very, very gifted in their ability to do that. One of the most famous was Leslie Flint, who worked for many decades in England and did many, many seances, and a lot of them were recorded. A couple used to come regularly to every seance and made a recording. And now there are hundreds of these recordings on the Leslie Flint Foundation website, and really quite wonderful to go there and listen to some of these voices. Most of them are people who you won't know about. They're people who live ordinary lives, but some of them are famous. The poet Rupert Brooke shows up in some of them. Oscar Wilde shows up in some of them. Mahatma Gandhi came through in some. So it's quite remarkable to listen to these voices and know that this is the spirit of someone after he passed away, and they describe what conditions are like in the afterlife. People have done a lot of research on direct voice mediums like Leslie Flint. One thing that they find is the voices that they hear don't come from the medium. They come from an area around him, maybe a foot or two over his head or off to the side. They speak in very different voices, some deep and gravelly, some the voice of a young girl or a young boy. They have very different accents depending upon what the individual was who's speaking. Many don't speak English. They have other languages. They speak in whatever language they spoke in life. And so voices coming through in French, Italian, German, Russian, Basque, Lithuanian, and even archaic Chinese have come through, sometimes in the same sessions, sometimes even simultaneously. They may have more than one voice speaking at the same time. So when people do research on this subject, there's a large volume of research that has checked out the reality and genuineness of top quality mediums like this. Many people have conducted these evaluations. One was a Professor William Bennett, Professor of Electrical Engineering at Columbia University in New York City. He did lengthy tests on Leslie Flint, and his conclusion, he said, my experience with Mr. Flint is firsthand. I've heard the independent voices. Furthermore, modern investigation techniques not available in earlier tests corroborate previous conclusions by indicating that the voices are not his. But to be thorough, one should consider the possibility of live accomplices. This suggestion became untenable for me during his visit to New York in September of 1970, when, in an impromptu seance in my apartment, the same voices not only appeared, but took part in conversations with the guests. So what I've concluded from a lot of this research is we have certain sources of the afterlife that to me are high credibility, like direct voice, that tell us things about the nature of the afterlife, what the conditions there are like, their experiences. And we have good reason to believe that they are genuine. So that's one of the sources of information that makes them part of my book. Another feature of the afterlife that's important for a lot of people are orbs. Orbs are often photographed in various situations with cameras and photographic environments. And orbs can occur from very commonplace conditions. Just a light off to the side can cause lens flare. A piece of dust near the lens can cause an orb to show up. Other things like that could cause artifacts. But in addition, there are genuine orbs that actually represent a spirit, an intelligent consciousness, and there are ways of checking that. There's lots of examples of real orbs of this type, and they're one more proof of the afterlife and the survival of the soul. Here's a photograph taken of a man while at the moment of death, and you see these several orbs or clouds of energy that are leaving his body that suggest something is surviving as his body passes over. Measurements of the weight of the body also show a sudden change at the moment of death. There's a certain about 21 ounces, 21 grams typically of decrease in weight in the body is seen at the moment that the body dies. Therefore, something left, something energetic that caused a change in weight. So that's one more clue that there's something there, something is going on. I'll have more to say about orbs in a few minutes, but I'll just say that as I've looked into them more and more, what I find is that many cultures talk about orbs and have placed orbs as an important way that we communicate with our ancestors and with the afterlife. Native Americans have the Lakota, for example, in South Dakota, have ceremonies, healing ceremonies, Yuwipi ceremonies, where the medicine man will be in the middle of the tent with all closed up and the entire tribe around him chanting, and they'll be praying for the healing of some individual. He'll be tied up, so he can't do very much. But as the ceremony proceeds, the people in the circle see little lit up bright orbs flying around the ceiling over their heads. And as they fly around, they hear little high, squeaky voices coming from some of them. They sometimes have different colors. What they say is, these are our ancestors. They have come to this ceremony to join with us to help us in this healing ceremony. So they recognize that their ancestors often come back and visit in the form of orbs. Likewise, when you look at the kahuna culture of Hawaii, they also describe the same thing. They say the soul has, one of the many forms of the soul is a small spherical object that has a voice. They call it uhane, and it has a voice that's able to talk to you. And that is a form in which our ancestors sometimes come back into the physical dimension to visit us for a while, to take part in the ceremony or to communicate or to just check in on how relatives back here are doing.
Um, Sylvia Brown, when she was a young girl, she was a well-known psychic. But when she was 7, she was brushing her hair, and an orb flew up near the side of her ear and began talking to her. And it was talking in this squeaky voice, and it scared the heck out of her. And she went running to her mother and said, "Mommy, Mommy, this orb is talking to me." And her mother was also a gifted psychic, said, "Well, sweetheart, don't worry, that's just your grandmother coming to talk to you." So some people know about orbs, and I found many accounts in my studies where people on the other side had been allowed to come back and visit this physical dimension to check on their family. They often have to have an escort or have permission from a guide or from a higher level spirit. But when they come back, they often come in the form of an orb, and they describe being in a little soap bubble and looking out at what the events around them are like. So it's amazing how much information you find about orbs when you start looking. Another way we've learned about the afterlife are the skull experiments, which were done in England in the 1990s. And they were a serious scientific examination of what mediums do and what goes on in a seance. And they involved real scientists as well as very gifted mediums. And they found out, in fact, they were actually told by the spirits that they were in contact with, because some of these gifted mediums communicated with the other side quite frequently. And they were being told that the other side, there were beings who want us to do these experiments. It's time for our society to learn about the nature of the afterlife, that our souls continue. We need to learn this. Science needs to wake up and change its tune and admit the existence of these realms. And so they wanted this experiment to be done in a way that scientists could also appreciate the reality of the afterlife. So here's what one of the documents about the Skull Project said. It says this project apparently formulated nearly 50 years earlier. We're talking about so in the 1920s and 30s, is when the early researchers were working, and that's when apparently the idea of the Skull Project was originated. So it was intended to provide a sophisticated and scientific literate public with irrefutable proof of human survival. And a significant part of the plan behind the work was to have special settings in which respected assessors, scientists, and intellectuals would be present along with the mediums, so they would see and experience what went on during a seance. The impetus, agenda, and planning for this work all ostensibly came to and not from the group. In other words, the beings in the afterlife were taking an active role in formulating and planning the Skull Project. And if you read the transcripts of their experiments, you find that they were actively interacting with the mediums and other scientists in the group to help manifest various phenomena that they wanted to see and help them understand what the afterlife is all about. This is just one artifact out of many, many, many that came out in the Skull Project, which went on a number of years. One of their projects was to use sealed canisters of photographic film. They were sealed at the factory, so all blank film. They brought them to the seance and then asked the spirits who were attending there, who can, of course, go right through a metal canister very easily. They asked them to draw things or write things or do communication with them. Then they would develop it afterwards under controlled conditions. One of the beings who had been speaking to them was someone who said his name was Thomas. Now we know Thomas Edison was interested and involved in afterlife experiments when he was an active inventor. back in the 20s and 30s, and that he hoped that some of his electronics would be successful at picking up afterlife voices. Be that as it may, one of the drawings that developed in this experiment was a circuit diagram, which you can see here. It is on the left-hand side is a piece of germanium, which is a semiconductor. It's being clamped down by screws, and it's being, one screw in the middle is tightened to apply stress to the crystal. So there's the crystal is under an unusual amount of stress, which alters its behavior. Then there are two other coils shown on the right, which it was explained by the spirits are for impedance matching. Well, that kind of language makes it sound like the spirit knows some electronics. And the signature in the lower right in the drawing is TAE, which were Thomas Alva Edison's initials. And when they wrote away to his museum, they found that his signature matches perfectly the signature on the film. So it might be that Thomas Edison took part in some of these experiments. So lots and lots of examples of the reality of the soul, these strange anomalous energies. One type of example comes from remote viewers. Remote viewers go out of body and go to the place where they're trying to gather information. In one set of experiments, a very adept out-of-body traveler named Alex Tenhouse went into another room, a closed room with a detector. That's sort of shown in this picture here. And there was an image being generated by one part of the experiment. And then his job was to describe what he saw. And the room was totally closed. The box that held all this electronics was suspended from the ceiling by elastic cords. It should have all been shielded. And yet when he tried to go and look at the picture that was being shown in the experiment, the detectors around it detected an anomalous energy that was present there. They had strain gauges, they had optical sensors, magnetic sensors. All of them went crazy. They all said there's some weird energy here right now. And that, we believe, is the out-of-body component of his astral body, as they say, or his soul body that had gone to that location to look at that scene, to report back on what was visible. So this tells us that the astral body or the soul body has some effect on physical measuring devices like magnetometers and strain gauges and things like that. And that's again so consistent with the idea of orbs that are also kind of energy forms that are of an anomalous form that we don't quite understand. Here's an experiment I did with Christopher Moon, who is a well-known ghost hunter in Colorado. I went with him to the bedroom of his old house where he grew up. He knew there were lots of orbs there, and we both had little night shot video cameras. We set up in the total darkness in the basement of the house, and we're hoping to be able to photograph some orbs. He was seeing some flit by, and he kept reporting to me that he was seeing them. But I kept looking on my camera, and I couldn't see anything. And I know that they move very quickly, and my eyes may be too slow to pick them up. So I asked him if he would mind telling them to slow them down so that I could get a picture of them. So he made an announcement to the darkness with an orb, please show up for my camera. And within about 2 seconds, an orb popped in right here. This is the night shot image from my camera when it first appeared. And there's an exercise machine or something behind it there. And the circle is added later to emphasize that that bright spot is the orb. It just turned on like a light coming on. And then the next 2 or 3 seconds, the frame numbers are shown here, this orb kind of sidled, moved slowly toward me and to the right, and it came toward me, and it occupied about 6 or 8 frames of camera film as it came to me. So the last frame is on the bottom there. So you can see that they did respond when he asked them to show up for us. And that's one of the things that I've learned from studying orbs, is that they are conscious. They respond to our intentions and our verbal requests, etc. So they show they're not just insect artifacts. I mentioned the Sylvia Brown case and the Kahunas, where they had direct experience with the ancestors. Another aspect of the afterlife, the kind of information we have about what it's like over there, comes from near-death experiencers, people who have been dead for a while and then are revived. And also a similar kind of information comes from those who are dying, and as they get closer and closer to death, their relatives often come to them from the other side and communicate with them. And sometimes they can even see into the other side as they approach death. One person who studied this process was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, medical doctor who had a lot of concern for the suffering of those who were dying and spent a lot of time with them. And she said it was remarkable. Doctors didn't want to deal with the dying. They were kind of almost like allergic to spending too much time or energy around the dying. But she talked to them, and she found that they were very willing to talk about what they were feeling and what they were going through. And that's from the beginning. She was the pioneer of the near-death experience and of the dying process in America. And she wrote a best-selling book about that process. And what she concluded is, as this says here, this experience is the same for everyone, regardless of whether you're an Aboriginal from Australia, a Hindu, a Muslim, or a Christian, or an unbeliever. Dying is a human process, in the same way that being born is normal and all human process. Dying is only moving from one house into a more beautiful one, if I may make a symbolic comparison. So that's what she concluded from hundreds and thousands of interviews. Another example we have that something very unusual happens when near-death experiences are reported. Some skeptics want to say, well, the person was just ill, or it was just some mundane explanation. But in fact, some very unusual things happen when people have near-death experiences that tell us that it's a genuine phenomenon. Dr. Ken Ring says our findings revealed that blind persons, for example, including those who have been blind from birth, report classic NDEs of the same kind as sighted persons. The great preponderance of blind people claim they're able to see. They can see perfectly well during NDEs and OBEs, and that occasionally claims of visual-based knowledge that could not have been attained by normal means can be independently corroborated. In other words, when you're dying or when you're dead or out of body or near death, suddenly you can see when you shouldn't have been able to based upon your physical organs. Here's some data just comparing the ability to see based on consciousness condition. And on the left is normal consciousness of people who are congenitally blind. And on the right hand is their ability to see during an NDE. And it's 80%. So what is seeing there is probably the astral body. It's probably the energetic part of the body that is now able to perceive the outside world without the interference of the physical. But it's dramatic evidence that during your death experiences, something very special has happened. Another example of that is the changes that we undergo after a near-death experience. When we come that close to the other side, it opens up our awareness, it activates certain energy patterns in us that we didn't have before, and suddenly we have more psychic ability afterwards. And this is a change that is often permanent. So this is a graph comparing the before NDE and the after NDE in terms of percentages for clairvoyance, telepathy, precognition, spirit rescue, out-of-body experiences, healing ability, the ability to see auras, and the belief in psychic phenomena. And it's showing a dramatic change in NDEs. So something really fundamentally has changed for the people who have them. Now I'll talk just a little bit about an explanation for some of these things from the Synchronized Universe model. And I won't belabor this, but I know that you've seen this before at some point. But this is the model that I presented in Volume 1. And it starts off by thinking of little particles like electrons as zipping around through space. And when they hit a photon, it causes them to bend and to change direction. And they often emit another photon that goes off into space when this happens. And if you took a powerful microscope and looked at a particle at the very smallest scale, an electron that appears to be sitting still would actually be a bunch of little arrows as its velocity changes back and forth, and as its path zigs and zags in a random looking pattern. And if you notice, the photons that it's emitting and the photons it's absorbing are coming from the distant matter of the universe, other particles that are far away from it. And one important piece of this model is that every one of those interactions involves almost like tunnel vision, where the electron, because it's traveling very, very fast, very near the speed of light, shoots its photon off in the direction that it happens to be traveling. So the photon is a very narrow influence that may only affect one other particle in the universe, and it may be very far away from it. But that'll cause a synchronization of the electrons in the universe, that the one that is very far away, that just happens to have the right direction at the right time, will receive that photon from the first one, and they will interact. They'll see each other, they'll pick up the energy, exchange forces, and they will interact, but it has to have the right motion and the right direction to be able to do that. And what that leads to then is that the particles that see each other on a regular basis will have a pattern, a motion pattern. They'll be moving in little orbits that are all in phase with one another. So their velocities point toward each other in a regular way at just the right time. They'll be the ones that see each other. They'll be the ones who will say, "You're in my universe. I'm in your universe. I feel a force from you. You feel a force from me." And this will be a physical universe from their point of view. Now, there can be many other particles that are moving in a different pattern, a different phase, a different frequency. They won't see any of this, or they may just see occasional influences that are registered as noise. But in general, they will be invisible to this first universe, but they can make up another universe. And so you can have many different universes, each having a different phase or a different frequency. And that leads then to the idea that you can think about the multiverse, which I'm sure you've heard talked about among physicists. They have different ideas on how that might come about, but it's a very natural consequence of the Synchronized Universe model. You can think about one sheet of paper and a stack of paper. That one sheet represents the physical universe. The particles on that sheet are all in the same phase. They're all interacting together, seeing each other, exchanging forces. They're saying, we are the universe. There can be many other systems of particles that are moving in different phases. They would correspond to different sheets of paper in the stack. They don't see the first sheet. So they would be invisible to it, in much the same way that the afterlife is invisible to us. However, you can imagine another being or another structure that has a higher dimensional point of view that can pass through and perceive all of the sheets of paper, and the particles of all different phases, and that might be act like a higher dimensional being that's present at the same time and can pass through. And that's represented by the green curve there. So this leads then very naturally to the idea of how you could have an afterlife, how you could have, in fact, not just one, but many different planes in the afterlife, each one at a different frequency. And the beings in one plane would only be aware of other beings in their same plane. They'd be unaware of beings in a different plane. So our physical universe here that we see is made up of the things that we're in phase with. But the afterlife can be right here, and all the higher levels of the afterlife can also be present right here and now. And yet we would not perceive them because their frequencies and phases are different. In the same way here I'm showing that two parallel universes can have objects that are quite different from each other. They can be co-located in the same place, but you only see one of them based upon your frequency. Now this model is also useful if you want to think about higher dimensions, because these little simple self-orbits I showed are only so the simplest, for instance, of the kind of orbit an electron might have. You can easily imagine a more complicated orbit, and here I'm showing some solid polygons as examples of a more complicated orbit, and a universe could be made up of these polygons. And the particles undergo very complicated orbits, but as long as their phases match, they would still see each other, and they would conclude that we are all part of a universe, but it's a higher dimensional universe than the first one. So you can see how this model can lead to higher dimensions. And for example, we hear talks about fourth dimensional and fifth dimensional beings that have been talked about in some of the programs about the secret space program and things like that. Jack Stuckey encountered a higher dimensional being while meditating and wandering his property in Colorado, and it communicated to him. I forget which dimension it said it was, but it told him that he would perceive it, that we humans would see it as a fractal being, because it's at a higher dimension. So it's only in our dimension a tiny fraction of the time. Therefore, we only see little slices of it. And he asked permission to take its picture, and the picture on the lower right of the frame is the photograph that he obtained. It looks like a fern. It is a fractal looking pattern. So this is a representation of a higher dimensional being. And those who do communication with spirits, who meditate, who make contact, are aware that higher dimensional intelligences often interact with our world, but here now is a photograph of one. So that's pretty neat. Another piece of this puzzle to try to bring consciousness and science together, I believe, is torsion. Torsion seems to go a long way toward explaining some of the missing parts of consciousness. And that's what my second book, Life Force, was all about, was torsion. And the third book, Signs of the Soul, is about torsion too, because the soul appears to be made up of torsion, at least in part. Here are what two of the torsion experts in Russia said about their research, because Russia began researching this in the 50s and began secret programs, big secret programs for many, many years, developed lots of technology. And even today, very little of it is acknowledged or understood or talked about in the West. Anatoly Akhimov said, during 20 years, torsion fields and torsion generators have been widely used to create torsion energy sources, torsion transport, torsion metallurgy, torsion systems of data transfer communication, torsion systems of medical diagnostics, etc. In other words, this is a well-developed technology in Russia, and yet in America it's not being taught, it's not being talked about very much. If you listen to some of David Wilcock's and Corey Good's lectures on Gaia, the secret space program, Corey shows a drawing of a craft, a cigar-shaped craft that he says he was in for many years, and it's powered by torsion. And there are pictures there of the spiral torsion fields around the craft that propel it. Well, here are Russians talking about a torsion transport. And one of the leading torsion experts in Russia, Gennady Shipov, has built a simple torsion transport device that works in the laboratory. So this tells us that this is a force that's very, very important and has been neglected in Western science. Here's another expert, Nachalov, who talks about what they've accomplished with torsion. He says from the late 80s until the late 90s, major experimental investigations were conducted that confirmed the theoretical predictions. It was established that torsion generators allow us not only to replicate all phenomena demonstrated by so-called psychics, but they're also able to demonstrate effects that were never demonstrated by any psychics. So in other words, all of the phenomena of consciousness that we're aware of are all connected to torsion. Torsion looks at space as consisting of an extra degree of freedom that Einstein left out, and that is twist. That space-time can have a twist to it. And so in the simplest way, you could think of a particle, a wave, that carries a twist with it as it moves through space. And one direction is twisting to the right. That would be a right-handed torsion field. Or it could go to the left-handed torsion field. These simple torsion waves are called phitons. They can also be traveling forward or backward in time. And there are experiments that show that torsion can travel both forward and backward in time. So that explains some of the mysteries about how healers are able to send their energy and their effect over distance. So it travels forward and backward in time, not limited by distance, not stopped by matter. And another aspect of it is it forms neural networks, which these torsion phitons or waves can connect together and form knots or create networks that fill the universe, and that will become important in a few minutes. You can see how a pair of phitons, for example, will interact. Each one exerts a twisting around it, and it twists another phyton when they come near each other. If they intersect with the right angle, they will form a thread or a rope or something more complex. And you can make fibers out of these space-time waves in this way. So if you want to understand what ectoplasm is, my hypothesis is that it's a combination of physical things like cells or the bodily fluids of the medium held together with an extra energy that's not a physical energy, this torsion energy which forms fibers, and they can interact with the matter of the medium and hold it together to give it a string-like quality, which seems to be the way ectoplasm is normally described. You could also take torsion fibers of this way and create knots from it, form knots out of the torsion fibers, which would have a persistence. They'd be able to survive for long periods of time. This is an example of a knot that might become a model for a soul, for example, because we know the soul is not a physical energy, and yet it has persistence over time. So this is just an idea about how you might make a soul by having a knotted structure of torsion. Torsion's also been used to change the rate of time and the direction of time. In some experiments, like Chernobyl, has created a container in which he radiates torsion waves into the container to make the ratio of left-handed to right-handed torsion different from what it normally is, and that either can slow down or speed up time. So again, it confirms this idea that torsion can affect the rate of time. So if you want to understand the effect of torsion on the physics of objects, this little picture can illustrate that. Here we have a particle. The red line is a particle, electron, for example, moving through time. And the vertical direction is time in the graphs. Horizontally is the space directions, and the blue lines are the distant matter, and the little dotted lines represent photons or photons being emitted by the particle in the middle, and they are causing the electron to be deflected, either left or right, and to take on a zigzag path, a random walk. And on the average, it moves forward in time, which means up the graph, but it goes backwards and forwards in a random pattern at the same time. However, if you notice the two pictures, on the left picture, the red line is moving up faster. It doesn't get knocked backwards in time as frequently. Most of its deflections are forward in time. And that would be the case when there are more right-handed photons, more right-handed torsion. It causes time to pass faster. The electron moves forward in time much faster. There, the mass of the electron will be much less because it's interacting less with its environment. The right-hand picture shows the opposite. If there's more left-handed torsion present, then it'll be knocked backwards in time more often. Its path will be more convoluted. It'll make progress in the forward time direction more slowly. And that's an example of what happens when left-handed torsion is much stronger. And in fact, the upcoming big flash and the period that I'm proposing that we're going through now, we're about to go through, is a period where left-handed torsion is increasing and will cause more changes like this. One effect of this is that there are more high-frequency turnings and twists in the pattern of the particle, and that'll have physical consequences. So here I'm saying that changing the density of left and right-handed photons is the key to many paranormal phenomena as well. It alters the behavior of matter, it affects events, and therefore is the key to energy healing and the power of intention, altering events to conform to our will and our vision. Another example that might be an application of torsion involves modifying space itself. We know that the universe, if you take telescope photographs of distant matter, it has a fibrous look to it. The distant galaxies seem to occur along strings and corridors that are connected in a very irregular way, as though there are fibers or preferred roots that are linked together along lines, like a cobweb. Well, when you consider the effect of torsion, here is a picture of what might happen if you had a combination of left and right-handed torsion that had the effect of kind of balancing out, of canceling out the time direction, so that the torsion waves, the right-handed torsion knocks the particle forward in time, the left-handed torsion knocks the particle backwards in time, and so as the particle moves through space, its time displacement is kind of on the average zero, but is being pushed in the spatial direction. So you can push a particle very rapidly in a particular direction in almost no time. And this, I propose, is an example, perhaps, of how we can understand torsion filaments in space, which is what Corey Goode has talked about in the Secret Space Program as some of these portals that enable us to go very rapidly from one place to another in space, if you can locate these portals and go through them. And it's a very radical concept for conventional astronomy, but it might be that if torsion really gets properly integrated into our physics, then we may find that this type of thing is very sensible. So it may be one of the keys to the big mystery of astrophysics today, dark matter and dark energy. Dark matter is claimed to be an anomalous attraction of matter to matter. It's extra gravity, basically. But that's exactly what left-handed torsion does. Left-handed torsion, based on all the experiments going back to Kozyrev in the 1950s, comes from extra gravity. It acts like an extra attraction. In the same way, right-handed torsion has a repulsive effect or anti-gravity effect, and that's exactly what dark energy has. So it appears as though dark energy and dark matter, which were discovered in relatively recent time, can be explained by left and right-handed torsion, which have been known about for 60 or more years in Russia. The power of an intention is one more way that torsion helps us understand how it's possible for a mind to shape reality, because our minds create these torsion waves, we send them out, they interact with the reality around us, and we can change the frequencies of the vibrations that are in our own plane of reality. And as we shift that, because we can change time, we can change frequencies. So we can shift a plane of reality that we're in to some other plane with has different events, and shift the future, shift the predicted future events by using our mind in this way. Another picture that helps explain what I think is happening now in the solar system, if left-handed torsion is in fact coming into our system in these clouds that we're passing through, is that it will affect the little self-orbits of all particles, which means that matter itself will start to change as it interacts with left-handed torsion. So here on the left-hand side here, you see a simple orbit, a simple elliptical orbit of a particle, a simple self-orbit, as we started out with in the Synchronized Universe model. But then as you put more left-handed torsion into the space, it'll get knocked backwards in time more often. Its path will become more convoluted. And as it does, it'll take on more little kinks and more little self-orbits. Those little kinks you're seeing there. And those represent higher frequencies. So now that self-orbit can couple not just to the basic self-orbit of matter in this reality, but can also couple to higher frequencies, such as some of the spiritual planes. If you go even further, the far right-hand picture shows an extreme case where the self-orbit has become very convoluted with lots of loop-de-loops and whirls, and many high frequencies now can be synchronized with this kind of self-orbit. So now a person who is in this condition, in this space, can start to connect to higher planes of consciousness. That's what I believe happens in these shifts that are being talked about. So to summarize, it means we become more in touch with the higher planes of consciousness, that a higher ratio of left-handed to right-handed torsion translates into a higher frequency, translates into what they call a higher density plane. It translates into higher harmonics and contact with higher dimensions. And what Corey Good says to summarize this is a change in density begins with an expansion of consciousness. So all of this is about how consciousness may be expanding as we go through this shift that we're talking about here. And the Synchronized Universe model appears to be a very good way of understanding that. And we're proposing that the great shift is really happening right now in our solar system, it appears to be. There's lots of evidence for that from many different sources. I went over that some in the last lecture, that there are many sources of people, either psychics, clairvoyants, or ET contactees, who are telling us the same story, that we're going through this huge shift today. It's one of the reasons that there are many ETs that are visiting us, why alien abduction has become such a big subject, and consciousness is also becoming a big subject now, because this really is coming into our awareness now. Now, some people in our society have made a practice of controlling their consciousness and developing their control to a very high level. They can control their vibrations. And as they do, they create more subtle energy, more left-handed torsion in their bodies, and they can control their frequencies. This is the 16th Karmapa, who is one of the reincarnations of Buddha, and he's quite gifted in this way. And he's sitting there, on his throne in the middle of the picture. But he's meditating in a way to energize his higher frequencies, so he's no longer very much in the present physical dimension. And now his body is almost invisible. You can see just little outlines of where his energy field is, but he has shifted most of his matter into the higher planes. So this is an example of someone who can control these frequencies even today. When the solar shift happens, the solar flash, we imagine that the simple self-orbits that most of us have as components of our matter will take on many, many high frequencies. And they'll start to look more like the right-hand image here, that have many high frequencies, and they may be somewhat chaotic when this intense event happens, because the solar flash will, according to the prophecies, bring solar material impinging upon the earth, and that'll be carrying with it left-handed torsion that has come from this matter that it's interacting with. When that happens, these many, many frequencies in the left-handed block in this picture, it's up to us to control those, to use our consciousness, to use our meditation to help synchronize our own energy field, and perhaps have others help us, but to select out from all these frequencies the ones that we need that will take us to the desired higher planes of consciousness. So by using our consciousness to say focus on meditation or prayer with contacting a certain higher plane, we can end up with the right-hand image where we have selected one of these higher frequencies that is now in a regular pattern that gives us best contact with a higher plane of guidance. And that would be an example of how ascension occurs, of how we can move to higher spiritual levels. And so what that means in summary is that we start off with the picture on the left here, a simple self-orbit, and then we draw a person in a business suit. The average American, let's say. But after the shift, if we control our consciousness and use this opportunity to focus on higher dimensions, higher guidance, we can raise our vibration and raise our self orbits to make much more contact with higher consciousness. Torsion photons, or waves, interact with each other and they create knots in space. In other words, they interact, they twist like I showed you before, and when they do, that can actually result in a neural network, a network of interactions of photons. If you think of these photons, these waves, as moving through space, these dashed lines here in the picture are an illustration of that. When they hit other photons, they can twist together and make a little knot. The more that come together, the more complicated the knot can be. And these are places where the photons can communicate with each other. They can transmit and transfer information from one to the other. This is like a spider web, but it fills all of space-time. It's there all the time. It's there at very high frequencies. It transmits information over huge distances very, very rapidly because it has components that travel backwards and forwards in time. So it's really an instantaneous communication network. So it ties together the entire universe in terms of consciousness into one being. So we can see how it's possible to explain the universe as one huge conscious being. And so this makes some of the spiritual assumptions and teachings combined together with a physics explanation. One noted spiritual expert, Don Elkins, has quoted from his research that the universe is one being. When a mind, body, spirit complex views another mind, body, spirit complex, we see the creator. And when we pray or meditate, we're connecting ourselves into this network, which is how we're able to get information from virtually anywhere in the universe. It's how remote viewers are able to access information about things that are far away in space or time, across barriers, etc., because they tie in to this network. When a yogi joins in with this network, he explains this is why yoga is called union with God, because the yoga really means yoke. It's a linking of our consciousness to this giant network. And it is ultimate or supreme intelligence in the sense that all knowledge is carried in this network. John Mack, as you know, he's a former professor at Harvard and did a lot of research on the contactees. He says, the cosmos that is revealed by this opening of consciousness, far from being an empty place of dead matter and energy, appears to be filled with beings, creatures, spirits, intelligences, and God. The idea that we live in a multidimensional universe populated by beings or life forms that are less densely embodied than we are, or perhaps not embodied at all. We participate in a universe or universes that are filled with intelligences for which we have cut ourselves off. That's our present society, of course, having lost the senses by which we might know them. And this is what he has learned from studying the abductees and contactees. It's how he's learned about how they view the real universe. And it's consistent with what the Synchronized Universe model and all of my research is indicating. So this torsion network, it makes a web of intelligent light. You can think of it that way. It fills the whole universe. And one near-death experiencer, in fact, almost all near-death experiencers report encountering this magical light that fills everything. And it's not just the regular old light that you're used to from a light bulb. This is intelligent light. It carries with it a sense of intelligence. And George Ritchie, one of the first near-death experiencers who wrote about it, said all the light bulbs in the ward couldn't give off that much light. All the bulbs in the world couldn't. Like a million welders' lamps, all blazing at once. Then he saw that the light came from a man or a being who had entered the room, a man made out of light. He perceived the command to stand up. It said, "You are in the presence of the Son of God." And this is just an illustration of what some people describe when they enter that tunnel, the near-death experience. They often encounter spiritual beings or relatives or both. This light is able to form itself, it seems, into many different things that we can understand and comprehend. Because this light is intelligent, it can take the form that is needed to communicate with each consciousness and each soul. As Raymond Moody discovered, the afterlife is part of an organized system. That structure will be explained in later lectures. Its overview can be summarized by a simple illustration. And this is the department store model of George Meek. And he said that based upon his findings, when we die, it's like entering the ground floor of the department store. There are elevators going up to different levels. We go up to the level that we're supposed to be at based upon our own development. But there are astral levels. There are actually 7, but we're showing here basically 3 astral levels. Then above that, there are higher planes, the causal and the mental planes. Above that, the celestial planes. And eventually, so the God level, where we are in complete contact and communication with all that is, with the mind of the universe. And typically our incarnation, our development, our soul involves going up and down these elevators back to the physical world to incarnate again, up to higher planes as we evolve, and eventually up into even higher planes where we don't have to come back to Earth anymore. We get to live in these higher planes. They're all more blissful than the lower ones. So the frequency of your soul determines the floor at which you find yourself in the afterlife. Through many lives, we learn our lessons and move to higher floors, ascending eventually to the highest planes of complete bliss and union with God. The description of God that emerges from these accounts is far greater than any described by earthly religions. This God is synonymous with the creation and with consciousness that extends throughout the universe, all planets, all species, animate or inanimate. So as we, as souls, are immortal and important parts of that creation. So Bob Monroe was right. We're more than our physical bodies. Through prayer, meditation, and visualization, we can create the world we want. And as Victor Hugo said, all of the armies of the world are not as powerful as an idea whose time has come. So thank you very much, and now we can take questions. I read that McDonald's experiments to prove that 21 grams of weight leaving the body at death were not accurate. Can you comment on it? Well, it's a matter of what data we have. I think there were some other experiments done later, but I haven't been able to look at those. He only had 6 people, I think, and 3 of them sounded like they were good data, and those are the ones he used. I think the problem is, number one, it's hard to know when somebody's going to die. Secondly, it's hard to find people who want to volunteer for this experiment. So we don't have too many data points. And so skeptics are always going to complain about the value of the data. You know, all I can say is it's the best data I'm aware of. And so what I've seen are some published experiments with animals where they found very inconsistent results. Some animals, even though they showed weight changes at death, they weren't permanent, they were only temporary. And that's kind of hard to understand. But at the same time, I know that Sorley did experiments, very well controlled experiments with worms in test tubes. And he could kill them, he could watch them and then kill them by releasing a gas inside the test tube without, it was a totally sealed system. And he found a weight loss in those test tubes as well. And proportionately to the human being, I think it was roughly comparable, comparing the weight of the worm to the person. It was not out of the ordinary, but it's the best we have right now. I mean, that's about all I can say. It turns out that if you look at Gennady Shipov's theory of torsion, that he shows how torsion fields can create mass, even with no matter present. And I tend to suspect that it's the torsion field that goes away when the object dies that's responsible for the change of mass. That's just my supposition. But, that's the best I can do right now. I just say it's the best data we have. And if there are volunteers to participate in further experiments, then that would be great. We'll make better experiments in the future. So I'll go on to the next question, I guess. Don't the torsion fibers look like DNA? They do to some extent, or they could if they're twisted in this way, if they fiber like that. And my suspicion is that probably torsion couples well to DNA because they both have that kind of twisting structure to them. So that may be why torsion is able to grab onto living cells and incorporate it into ectoplasm. That's just a hypothesis. At the present time, I'm just kind of doing the best I can with the information I have on torsion. The torsion fiber stuff, it would be really nice to get more data about this, but this is where I am right now with it. Let me see. How do we raise our vibration through meditation? There I would say ask a yogi. I mean, Yogananda, in his the self-realization fellowship program, shows ways to do that. Basically, the Kriya Yoga technique that they teach involves getting the prana, or I think of a left-handed torsion, moving up the spine from the lower chakra up to the crown chakra. And as you do that, you sort of energize the body and you can kind of raise your vibrational level. But I'm not an expert. I'm not very good at doing it myself, let's put it that way. But I think it's possible. Well, for one thing, as Corey Good points out, your diet plays a big role. You want to stay away from heavy foods like meat things, and the more vegetarian your diet, the better. Meditation and vegetarian diets, I think, are two ways to raise your vibration level. But as far as how the 16th Karmapa does it, we're talking about traditions that are very ancient, and I'm not really qualified to explain that. Since I can't do it, I really probably can't tell you too much more about it than that. Typically, there's some chanting involved and some meditation involved, but I don't really know any more than that. I have not learned how to levitate either. So. This one, Sharon Reese.
Oh, good.
My nephew died. I saw him materialize before me. At first, it was like his face was pushing through pantyhose, and then it looked more like him, but sort of wet with light. It seemed as if he was coming through from some other dimension. Have you heard of this before? That's pretty interesting. I, I I haven't exactly, but there are similar things. I mean, I know that there are quite a few people who report having contact with loved ones who recently died. That's one of the most frequent times they come through is fairly soon after death. Um, so I don't know. The pantyhose makes it sound almost like it's a little holographic. Um, I know that as we die, there's an important process as we dissolve the layers of energy around our body that kind of tie us to the physical world. It's called the etheric sheath around the body, which seems to be our link to the physical. And it's important to let go of that if we want to move on to the astral and the higher planes. And that can often linger for several hours and several days. So it's possible maybe he was somewhere in the middle and that etheric sheath was still a little bit present maybe, and maybe that enabled him to show up in the physical. I don't know, that's just my total speculation there. But it's pretty interesting. He was smiling really big. I'd been very distraught when I saw him. The wave of peace washed over. That's really nice. That's very nice.
Yeah.
So he was trying to reassure you. That's wonderful.
There are a lot of accounts of people seeing loved ones, shortly
Well,
after.
there are plenty of accounts of people showing up soon after death. There are quite a few of those.
Mhm.
The pantyhose, I can't duplicate
Mhm.
that, but I have lots of accounts of loved ones, sometimes who are far away even, uh,
Mhm.
battle, things like that. They'll show up at the bedside of somebody when they're in bed at night or something, and or they'll show up in their room and have a conversation with them. And so I presume that that's their out of body form. They're able to have an out of body experience very easily when they are dead like that in those early times before they fully move on to the higher planes. That's just my guess. But yeah, I have lots of examples of that. In fact, one of the examples that I mentioned in the book is this lady who uh, wanted to go visit her daughter who had a new baby, and the woman lived in California, and she had bought a new dress, planning to wear it to visit her daughter. But she was fixing dinner and took a little nap and was wearing her apron when she went to take her nap. And at that moment, she appeared in her daughter's house, 500 miles away, wearing her new red dress. Um, and her daughter and husband were startled to see their mother show up there. But she looked quite three-dimensional, quite real, even though she was wearing the red dress that she had never actually put on back home in California, and she was not wearing her apron. So she kind of showed up in a form that she would like to appear at for her daughter. The first thing they thought is that they wondered if she was dead because they'd never seen this type of thing happen before. Apparently, OBEs can be a cause for it as well.
Yeah. Somebody was on chat and says, hello, just making sure my question on manifestation came through properly. I haven't seen a question on manifestation. Have you, Claude?
I did not, no.
So maybe you should type it again in the Q&A. Oh, here it is.
Let's see.
Okay, it says,
Hold on.
hello, could you speak a little on pre-birth planning of death scenarios and how this might interfere with manifestation efforts? Thanks so much.
Pre-birth planning of death scenarios. You mean?
Well, in other words, the idea that prior to birth, we choose certain experiences and
how you want to die in that lifetime?
well, not just how you want to die, but also, you know, trials maybe that you undergo, situations that you find yourself in, you know, and let's say you plan some kind of illness, you know, because you know it's going to teach you something that you need to learn. And so then you have the illness and you don't realize you chose it, right?
Right.
And so you want to focus and manifest the healing, you know, getting over it. I think this is what Teresa is asking, you know, if there's certain pre-birth planning of, well, she says death scenarios and how this might interfere with manifestation efforts.
In other words, if you're trying to manifest a different outcome than you had planned in your pre-birth.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Obviously, in the lifetime that we're going to be undertaking, obviously these things we do think, as you seem to know, that how we're going to learn and what we're going to study and what we're going to teach and experience in the lifetime that's coming up, and if there's something we're supposed to learn in the way that we die, that could be really important. And I guess I don't know. I mean, if when we're faced with that final event of an imminent death, and we start trying to heal ourselves or trying to avoid the death, then clearly you have a conflict there. And I guess what I've seen is that a lot of times outcomes can be changed. That it's possible, especially if there is some kind of spiritual connection, perhaps to change the outcome. I guess it depends on what the highest good is for the soul. If you still need that form of death to learn your lessons, then hopefully you'll be able to figure that out. And that'll make it easier to undergo it. But I think a lot of these outcomes probably are changeable if we apply enough energy and enough. I mean, for example, it might be as you approach death of that type, maybe you can, by meditating upon it, you can learn the lessons that you need to learn, and then it wouldn't be necessary to undergo that form of death because you've already learned it in some other way.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
there's one more question.
It's a deep question.
It is a deep question.
Yeah.
But I agree with what you say. I think we can affect, you know, through our consciousness and through raising our consciousness and learning the things, you know, deliberately rather than by default.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Ward.
I know that in prayer, a lot of times I will say thy will be done, because
Mm-hmm.
it's clear ultimately that, the God of the universe, the supreme intelligence, that whatever is the best will happen anyway.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's easier to deal with it when we can relax and go with it, and allow it to happen. But at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, we can also ask for our own highest good and for our own learning to occur. And so it might be that if we can accomplish the learning, then we can avoid some of the more painful paths. Um, so let me read here from Ward. My wife passed away to a new realm that we call heaven, and I have seen her several times for a few seconds each time. That's pretty neat. Um, and I take it you've seen her in meditation or in prayer, or does she sort of show up at random times or bedtime? I wonder what the conditions are when she shows up. I mean, certainly we have lots of examples of people who do encounter loved ones who have passed away, and they do come back and communicate with us. They often do it in dreams, or when we're relaxed, sometimes meditating or in prayer. Uh, I guess sometimes they leave little signs during normal consciousness. They might move something or make a noise, or you'll see a shadow, or you might hear a voice in your head, something like that. So I'm kind of curious, what form she shows up, but it does happen, no question about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's wonderful. That's great.
Here's the answer. She showed up usually in the middle of the night in full color at a much younger age.
Wow, that's great. That's
Mhm.
great. And that's one of the other erasing one of the other points that's obvious, that's often commented on, that when we in the afterlife we do go to a younger age, we go to the ideal. Eventually, the ideal of our prime, typically 20s or 30s, um, and because that's where our mind, I guess, has us our ultimate pattern of how we look is probably
Mhm.
stored there. So typically, that's how we look in the afterlife.
Well, that photo that you showed of Auntie, whoever it was, I don't remember, Auntie May.
Egg, on egg, yeah.
Oh yeah, she appeared as an old woman, right? I
Yeah,
would say that that was to make herself be recognizable to those who only knew her.
that's right. She actually said that,
Ah, mm-hmm.
so that spirits who manifest in seances have a choice of whether they want to show up as the way they would be best recognized, or as they actually are in the afterlife. And they can do it either way. So these patterns seem to be in storage as part of our soul, and we can use them as we need to.
Mm-hmm.
But it certainly helps when people pass over into levels, and they recognize loved ones, they see others that they have known. It's handy that they can recognize them. So, uh,
It would defeat the purpose if they couldn't.
yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Let's see any other questions. Maybe it. Oh, here, Ward added,
Okay.
2 nights after her death, the lights in my house flashed very rapidly, and then that's when it started.
Wow, that's pretty neat. So she's pretty adept at controlling her energies to be able to do that. That's pretty neat.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Ward gave a presentation at Caritas about such things.
Uh-huh. That's wonderful. Yeah, there was a nice book by a lady whose boyfriend died, and his name was Chip Oney, and he began coming to her in dreams afterwards, explaining how he'd been killed by something. He kind of gave her the information about how he'd done it and all those things.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, she became a really good medium herself,
Uh-huh.
all of her experiences.
Yes, and that's one a very classic way that spirits can communicate. You know, loved ones can communicate with their loved ones in the physical plane is through dreams, because when we're asleep, we don't have as many filters up.
Yeah.
And so we're much more receptive, and it's easier for them to get through.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we have another reply down here. He says, I published 2 books on this, but I don't want to promote them here. But well, thank you, Ward. That's very interesting. I'll look into that.
There's a chat from Sharon. Do children grow older looking in the after? Oh, do children grow older looking in the afterlife?
The answer is yes. Yeah, typically we age toward our ideal age, which for men, for males is around early 20s, and women, I'm sorry, for men, well, for both groups in the 20s to early 30s. So, so if you die as a child, you grow up to that age, and if you die as an old person, you regress, you go backwards to the ideal age. But again, as you pointed out, you can show yourself in the age that they would recognize.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have cases when of children who need to be recognized by their siblings who appear as they were as children.
Mm-hmm. I suppose it would also have to do with identification in terms of the child still identifying as a certain age. Some people adjust to the afterlife more easily and quickly, and other people who are still more identified with their body and the life that they left may still think that they're sick or think that they're tired, that kind of thing.
Yeah. But as they say, we have a lot of power over our consciousness. Has so much power over us, over how we appear. So we can,
yes,
if we want to appear a certain way, we probably can do it.
Okay.
Well,
don't see any more now.
Thank all of you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Claude. I'll say goodbye.
Okay.
And we haven't selected a date for the next lecture, but we'll talk about it and watch your emails and you'll see it, right?
Thank you all. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.